Check the number on your thermostat right now. 68, 72, you tapped it once, months ago, and haven't thought about it since. For roughly 300,000 years, every single person in your bloodline faced that exact same problem, every single winter, and there was no dial to turn. No furnace, no walls with insulation hidden inside them, just their own hands, the bones of dead animals, and a cold severe enough to kill an unprepared modern person in a matter of hours. Get it wrong, and you didn't wake up. So how did they not merely survive that world, but actually build lives inside it? The answer isn't the one you're picturing, and once you hear it, you'll never look at your own living room the same way again. First, you need to understand what this cold actually was. We're not talking about a brisk morning waiting for your car to warm up. On the open steppe during the last glacial period, temperatures regularly dropped toward 40 Fahrenheit. At that point, exposed skin starts dying within minutes. Every breath is painful. The wind isn't just uncomfortable, it actively stalks you, finding every gap in whatever you're wearing. Drop an untrained modern human into that environment overnight, and there's a real chance they don't see morning. The image most of us carry is a handful of people huddled around a weak fire, shaking, just barely making it to sunrise. That image is basically fiction. What the archaeological record actually shows is a species of engineers. Here's the first thing popular history gets wrong. Your ancestors mostly weren't cave dwellers. At sites in Russia dating back roughly 800,000 years, archaeologists have uncovered deliberately dug circular pits, some over 8 feet deep and 12 feet across, with clear tool marks proving they were excavated on purpose, not naturally formed. The reason for that specific depth isn't random. 6 to 8 feet down, the ground holds a temperature 20 to 30 degrees warmer than the air above it. Your ancestors weren't fighting the cold head-on. They were going underneath it. The real leap in sophistication shows up later, at Dolní Věstonice in the modern-day Czech Republic, roughly 26,000 years old. There, researchers found winter shelters built with walls made of stacked, purpose-built layers. On the inside, animal hide with the fur turned in, trapping body heat close to the skin. Next, dried moss and grass, absorbing and wicking away moisture. On the outside, tightly woven reed and bark, blocking wind while still letting trapped moisture escape before it could freeze and tear the structure apart from within. This is not trial and error. This is layered thermal design, the same underlying principle as the vapor barriers and weatherproof shells built into your house right now. Different materials, identical physics. Then it gets even stranger. At sites like Mezyrek and Kostenki in Ukraine and Russia, archaeologists found something that genuinely stopped researchers in their tracks the first time it was excavated. Full houses, not caves, not lean-tos, built entirely from the skeletons of woolly mammoths. Skulls weighing over 200 pounds each, stacked as a foundation. Curved tusks locked together into dome frames. Smaller bones packed into every gap for structural strength. The whole thing wrapped in stitched mammoth hide, dense enough to stop wind, shaped precisely enough to shed snow instead of collecting it. That's not desperation. That's architecture. And when modern researchers built working replicas to test the theory, the results were almost hard to believe. A properly constructed mammoth bone house could hold interior temperatures 40 to 50 degrees warmer than the outside air, using nothing but small fires. Some modern Arctic field shelters, with industrial-grade insulation and electric heat, don't outperform that. People working with nothing but bone, hide, and stone tools matched, or beat, modern cold-weather engineering. None of it worked without fire, though. And fire wasn't a luxury inside these shelters. It was the entire life support system. The heating setup inside a mammoth bone house was genuinely organized. One central hearth carried the main heat load. Smaller hearths were placed around the edges, each creating its own warm microzone for a specific job. One spot for cooking, another for toolmaking, and the warmest corners reserved for infants and the elderly. Nothing about that layout was accidental. Out on the treeless steppe, wood wasn't always available, so an entire alternative fuel economy developed. Dried mammoth dung, processed bone treated specifically to burn longer and hotter. Residue analysis from ancient hearths shows this fuel wasn't just thrown on haphazardly. It was prepared and managed like an engineered resource, not a last resort. Then there's ventilation, and this is the detail that impresses modern cold climate engineers the most. Any sealed shelter builds up moisture fast from breath and from cooking. In sub-zero air, that moisture freezes solid and can destroy a structure from the inside out. At Kostenki, the evidence shows deliberately designed airflow. Small low openings pulling in fresh cold air, and larger openings near the top letting warm, moisture-heavy air escape before it could freeze. That's not instinct. That's applied physics, worked out through generations of trial and correction. Here's the part almost every documentary leaves out entirely. What happened inside these shelters once the sun went down? For hundreds of thousands of years, people went to sleep near dusk and rose before dawn, but they didn't sleep the way you do. They slept in 2 blocks, roughly 4 hours, then a waking period of an hour or 2, then another 4 hours until morning. That wasn't insomnia. It's the default human sleep pattern, documented across dozens of historical cultures, and confirmed experimentally in 1992 when psychiatrist Thomas Ware removed modern volunteers from all artificial light for a month. Every single participant drifted back into that same 2-phase rhythm. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent years studying the Jujuo-Hansi people of the Kalahari, one of the last groups living close to that original rhythm. She found a stark split in what people talked about depending on the hour. During daylight, roughly 80% of conversation was practical, logistics, hunting, resources. But after dark, around the fire, about 81% of conversation shifted to storytelling. The fire wasn't just a heat source. It was the first theater, the first classroom. That timing lines up with the art. Most of the famous Venus figurines from this period were found in winter shelter contexts. Much of the cave art from this era was created during the long stretch of winter confinement. The art that defines how we remember this species wasn't made in the ease of summer. It was made by firelight, inside bone houses, while the steppe outside was locked in ice. None of this happened spontaneously, either. Building a mammoth bone house took roughly 2 to 3 weeks of hard labor from 8 to 10 adults, which means construction had to start in late summer or early autumn, well before the ground froze and outdoor work became impossible. Toolware analysis and seasonal markers back this up. These weren't people reacting to a crisis. They were running seasonal calendars in their heads and planning months ahead. Food storage followed the same logic. In permafrost regions, underground chambers linked to the shelters by short tunnels functioned as natural freezers, keeping meat preserved and accessible all winter long, even through the worst storms. Clothing used the identical composite principle as the shelters themselves, multiple layers of different animal hides, each chosen for a specific job. Wolf, fox, Arctic hare, an inner layer to trap warm air, an outer layer to shed wind and moisture. It's the same engineering logic as a modern winter jacket, arrived at independently, roughly 25,000 years before Gore-Tex existed. And when a shelter got damaged, which happened constantly, it was repaired immediately. The archaeological record shows continuous maintenance through the winter months. Broken bones swapped out, hide patched, insulation replaced. This wasn't something built once and left to hold up on hope. It was a living system, actively managed all season long. When the Ice Age finally ended and forests spread back across the landscape, all of this knowledge simply faded out. Not lost in some disaster, just gradually rendered unnecessary. And it's worth noting that modern Arctic engineers studying these ancient shelter remains have genuinely been caught off guard by how effective the designs were. Military cold weather training programs now teach shelter building methods pulled straight from these 0-year-old blueprints. Disaster relief organizations have adapted the same techniques for emergency housing in extreme conditions. We lost this knowledge, spent about a century rediscovering it with modern science and engineering, and found out it had already been solved, perfectly, with bones and stone tools. So go check that thermostat, or that heating app on your phone. The number sitting on it would have seemed miraculous to your ancestors, not because achieving warmth was beyond them. They achieved it in conditions harsher than anything you'll ever have to face. It's miraculous because of what it cost them to get there. Every warm night was the payoff for weeks of preparation, months of planning, constant physical labor, and an engineering knowledge so exact that one serious mistake could mean a family didn't wake up. The bedtime stories you tell your own kids tonight are direct descendants of the stories told by firelight inside bone houses on a frozen steppe. You didn't invent warmth. You inherited it from the most resourceful engineers who ever lived, armed with nothing but cold, time, and a refusal to die. Next time you reach for that thermostat without a second thought, remember exactly what it used to cost to get there, because being warm right now is far rarer and far more hard-won than you've ever stopped to consider.